On today's episode, we are going to be diving into some of the traumas that we've experienced in our lives, a lot before we are married, some after we are married, that are keeping us from really living to our fullest capacity. We're struggling identifying certain emotions because we have blocked them at some point in our lives. So we are diving today into what it looks like to pop the lid on that emotion so we can truly connect, not only in our relationship, but really connect with ourselves. So welcome to the Connection Codes. This is the podcast where we break open our emotions that take us from being disconnected to connected in our relationships and in ourselves. I'm your host, Tara Wages, and joining me is marriage and family therapist, clinical sexologist, Dr. Glenn Hill, and his incredible wife, who he claims is the smart one in the relationship. She puts everything together for what they have now founded as the Connection Codes, which is the guide to human connection. And we're so glad you're here.
Yes. Hello, world. We're very glad.
Hi, friends.
Yes.
Yeah, wow. What a good question. And it is interesting, just your response to that, because I know for me, just in the last few weeks, I've been doing a lot. Glenn and I both have been going through kind of a workbook that takes you back through childhood stuff. And, you know, it's interesting because I think that Glenn and I have had many, many conversations over the 44 years that we've known each other about our childhoods. And I would say it has morphed over time. Like when we first met, it was almost like just a factual. For Glenn, he left home at 14. I grew up in Germany. Like it was, when we first met, it was just kind of facts without any emotion attached to it.
Right.
Or even realizing like words like trauma.
Yeah.
And it was many years after we were married. We were a part of so it was probably 25 years ago. We were part of a workshop day, and we were answering questions, and it was like this is how the whole thing started. It was like, paint a picture of your childhood. And for me, I was like peaceful, calm, consistent. Those were my words. And I don't remember what your words were, but nowhere in there did Glenn reference the trauma and chaos of his childhood. So I don't know that you painted a picture quite like mine, but I was just shocked. And I think shortly after that is when I referenced your childhood as trauma, but we were speaking and you were like, what are you talking about? And it was like, babe, oh my word, your childhood, your dad died when you were 8 and your mom had to go to work to support y'all. And so you didn't see her ever again, or rarely ever. And you had to learn to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or honey sandwiches.
Peanut butter and honey,
Peanut butter and honey, yes.
That's important.
But, it's like, I feel like we went for decades not understanding the impact of both of our childhoods, like what it did to us and kind of what it formed in the behaviors as us as adults,
Right.
And even how we function within our marriage. And then more recently, I feel like we've been digging it all back up in some ways and thinking through things even with a different lens than 10 years ago.
Right. Yeah. I think oftentimes we get married and we're so excited to be starting our own new family that we just feel like we can leave everything else that happened up to that moment behind us, and we either just want to forget or we just don't realize how much it is actually affecting our day to day, and don't realize that to take it into account when I am trying to interact with Wes on a daily basis. I am also interacting with Wes, what he experienced at 12, what he experienced at 15, what he experienced at 7, but we don't recognize that. And so much of what makes us who we are all of the events that happened to us before we met our partner for the majority of people. And so I've been experiencing in the last few weeks, I've had some health issues here recently, and just trying to, and I don't have a relationship with my biological father. And so it was just like, I was interacting with Wes when I was like, I feel like that I have crappy DNA and I don't even get to access that DNA to find out what's going on.
Wow.
And I ended up finding an email that I had sent to his wife, my stepmom, back in 2012 when I was pregnant to be like, hey, can you give me family history just so I know I need to know these things. And I was experiencing in the last few weeks some of his medical problems that he dealt with every day. And I was like, okay.
Wow.
And so it's just felt like it's just stirred up some things inside of me and some emotions. So I just thought it was so important that we talk about this because you can't forget. I mean, you can forget, but you can't unshape what has been shaped inside of you that happened before you met your partner.
Yeah, and with the connection, because we say there's an upside and a downside to everything. The upside about humans is we're incredibly resilient.
Yeah.
And we're adaptable, and we just keep adjusting. The downside of that is we don't realize, just as Phyllis was referencing, it literally never occurred to me that I had traumatic events in my childhood. And the first time she used that word, and I said to her afterwards, I was like, were you just trying to like make a point, like embellish or something? And she just looked at me like, what? And at that point, I think, would that have been when I don't remember. But anyway, there was somebody that had a child that was about 8 years old. My father passed away when I was 8. And she said, do you think that child would not be affected if their dad died today? And I'm like, well, duh, that's obvious, but it didn't occur to me that, that's my story.
Right.
I had no idea. So, I just learned to adapt. And I actually used the phrase with her at the time. I said, well, no, that was just a series of unfortunate events. And that was before the movie came out. So when the movie came out, I was really struck by that too. It was like, oh, that's the story of my life. And I just had no concept that these are problems. These are challenges. These have an effect on you, which you can't change. It is not that, well, now we're going to magically sprinkle fairy dust in and it'll change. But just to be aware that, okay, that comes into play for me today with what's happening. And to be able to do that, because our goal is just to exist in the present. And I do get concerned sometimes with all the psychoanalytical stuff where, we're saying, you've got all these repressive memories, which can be true. I know that. But what we really want to do is just find out what's happening for this individual right now, today. And that may go back to what happened when he or she was 6 or 11 or whatever. But we really need to find out what's happening in the present, in the current, because we can't change the past. But we can process through what's happening for us today based on what happened 20, 30, whatever years ago.
I think even realizing that as an 8-year-old, when you go through something so traumatic, your body wants to protect you. And so there's reactions that happen in your brain that create a protection.
Yeah.
And I think that in a sense, that part of you can stay there in that for 50 years, 60 years, like until you really almost go back into that and tell your body, I'm okay now. Like you can let me go, or you can thank you for all the protection. And, and I do think, for many of us, it's like we don't slow down enough to really even question. Because, like I think that just recently I was talking with some other couples that are parents, and I was saying, Glenn left home at 14. So you would almost say, his family of origin was 14 and younger, 14 years of his life and younger. And for me, I left home at 17. And so you go, wow, the majority of our life, many more years we have spent together.
Right.
And yet those first, that first decade, that first chapter of your life has such a huge, huge, huge impact.
Right.
Which, if you're listening and you're parents of small children, it's like that reminder that, whoa, everything we're doing has such an impact on these kids.
Yeah.
And
It's terrifying.
And it is terrifying. And that's the conversation actually that we were having with these other parents. And I said, yeah, man, I almost feel like we should all wait until we're 50 and then start having children. Because maybe by 50, we've figured this stuff out
Yeah.
and we have worked through all of our own childhood stuff so that we are the best versions of ourselves.
Yeah.
And then we can have children.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And yet it doesn't work that way. Most of
Right.
us have children really young when we're still trying to figure out just life and, all the things that are coming at you. And then you're trying to be a parent and to parent well. And many of, not many, I don't know what the percentages are of people who go into parenting going, I want to do something different than what my parents did. I know that was our story. Like we really were super intentional, but we didn't even realize the impact. And so now, I mean, I feel like even just in the last couple of weeks at 60, I'm realizing, man, I have a really hard time tuning into anger. And that's been a new thing that I didn't realize. As often as I've done the wheel, it's like, wow, anger is a really hard one for me.
Right.
And it kind of, you go, okay, how far back does that go? And I've really had some incredible opportunities in the last couple of weeks, both in conversations and in some therapy sessions, where it's like going into the idea that rage is something I don't touch, and anger is in that, and it's like, so you go, okay, how far back does that go? And one of the exercises that I did took me back to when I was 15 and realizing my parents were about to move us again. We moved a lot and were about to move us to Texas from South Carolina. And the exercise kind of went like, say to your parents what you would really like to have happen. And I was just like, oh, no, you don't understand. I didn't have a voice. I had zero voice. There was like, I was that, what on paper, I was, well, not just on paper, I was the good girl. Like I was just always obedient, never asked questions, never even stood up against my dad. And my mom had no voice either. So my dad would just decide, hey, we're moving. And we would never question. It was like, okay, here we go again. And at 15, it was really like significant. I'd already met Glenn, and we lived in a place that I loved. The church we were part of, I loved. There were so many really, really beautiful things in my life at that time. And going to Texas meant, once again, starting over, having no friends, having to make friends, a new school, high school, don't know anybody. It was such a painful experience. And yet going through this exercise, it was like, I had no voice.
Yeah.
And so you go, okay, so then when did you get your voice back? So that's interesting, because then, I married young. I don't know that I had a voice then either. Like I never even questioned not having a voice. I know it was very painful for me that my mom didn't have a voice, because I wanted her to stand up for me. I wanted her to be in my corner, and she never could do it until after I left home, and a lot of things happened. And then, and really my dad died when I was only 25. So my mom gained her voice after he died and really expressed a lot of anger. And she had quite the rage after he died, went through just a period of having to get all that out of her body, that she never had a voice. And so she just, in painful ways, would just go along with everything he said and did. And so, now at 60, I'm going, whew, how far back does this go for me?
Right.
I think I have blocked anger. That was definitely never shown in my family. Like no one ever raised their voice maybe my brothers, but not my parents. And I was you weren't allowed to raise your voice, right? So you weren't allowed to express what I would say was anger. And I was a very silent, very quiet person. Matter of fact, I remember, Glenn often tells the story when he met me that he just thought I was a snob or stuck up or quiet.
A rich snob.
Yeah, somehow that was the label. But
You weren't rich and
I
you weren't a
was
snob.
I was not rich, and
But I was close.
but I was super quiet because I
Right.
was constantly starting over, constantly, and I didn't have a voice at home.
Right.
And so quiet was what was acceptable, and that's what I became. And then, even with our religious heritage, women were not allowed to speak, and where what I grew up in. And so that fit really well. And then I met Glenn, who definitely talked more than I did. And I just didn't even question that I should have a voice. Like, it was just like, okay. And so I think, wow, now at 60, unwinding all of that and finding my voice, but also realizing you got to tap into that anger, which sounds a little scary to me because it's
Yeah.
like, I feel like if you've kept a lid on something for 60 years,
Right.
woo,
Yeah.
when you take that lid off, what's that going to look like?
Right. Because whether or not you recognize the anger happening or process the anger happening, your body did. And so you've had that stored inside of you for all this time. And that's why we talk so deeply about the need for processing, the need for recognizing and for saying it. Because if you're not verbally doing it, it's getting stuck into your cells, into your immune system, into every part of how you function as a person. And so it's vital to do
Yeah.
that. And so now that you are unwrapping this, you're going through a workbook, the two of you together. Many of these conversations, I felt you've shared with me, y'all have had many of them before.
Sure.
But what does that look like for you as you're like undoing this? How is it affecting you mentally? I'm trying to think for couples that are starting therapy themselves and how it gets so much harder before it gets better and what it looks like to take the lid off of something or break the dam of your relationship. And so what would you say to them that are going through this at the same time that you are?
Well, I hear our oldest daughter echo. For the longest time, she has said, Mom and Dad, I think y'all, when you teach the dam breaking, I don't think you emphasize enough how crazy that is. Like how it leaves the partner like devastated for a moment. And a moment could be weeks. I mean, it is extremely painful when there's a dam that breaks within. And I think people can have maybe what we would call little dams, but then there's some who have been built up. It's like the Hoover Dam. If anyone has ever seen a picture of the Hoover Dam, it's like beyond belief how much concrete is in that dam. I cannot even imagine if the Hoover Dam, if anyone ever dropped a bomb right there and blew that thing up, I cannot imagine what damage that would do because it's so huge. And often it's interesting because I think even when we teach this, I think I always picture like almost kind of a dam that's been built by the beavers. So it's just
like my kids at your house last week.
Yes, exactly. Just a few rocks were moved or a few sticks were put together and the water stopped flowing freely. But when I picture that versus the Hoover Dam, that's very different type dam breakings.
Right.
And so I think that, I know that for me, the last few weeks have felt like the biggest dam ever for me to just, and I don't even know, maybe I'm just chiseling at the dam. I'm not sure it is totally broken yet.
Yeah.
But it's like I am realizing I have, my body's been blocking this for possibly 60 years.
Right.
And so it's like, whoa, that's, and I mean, I think for you, it's been probably, you could speak to that. Like, it's not been a fun few weeks of me trying to figure this out. And I think that though I keep thinking I now can't go back. Once the dam starts to crack,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
you don't start putting,
Plaster on it.
I've had some moments where I've been tempted just to give me some, mix up some, whatever you do, some concrete. I want to but there's no way. At this point, I need to stay on this track until I get through it. And I think that, and I do believe, I know that what is on the other side will be amazing. But when you're in the middle of it, sometimes you just go, I don't think I want to continue this journey.
Right.
And I think we hear that from our listeners where people are like, yeah, that's too hard, or the wheel is too painful, I'm not doing it. And it's like, well, you have that right. You have that option, but then you're not releasing it from your body. And eventually your body is going to say, I've had enough. And it'll come out in other ways for sure.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and as you say, it can be so intense. And of course, we always tell people when a dam bursts, you just hold on for dear life. And I wish I had a better idea. That doesn't help people because they're like, wait, what? I just have to endure this. But it's true because when the dam bursts, it's so chaotic. And it may not last for weeks. I mean, I've seen lots of dams burst that take minutes to, process through. But it has to process through because, and again, these things maybe have been built up for years and years. So again, I don't do a whole lot of just regressive stuff going back. Say, okay, what was it like? Excuse me, when you were 6? But they'll take themselves there. They will be able to go back because all of us do that. I experience what I experience today based on what I experienced at some time in the past, because everything is in the past, whether it was yesterday, week, month, year, 10 years, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And another big thing I think is important, connection code protocol, that the brain doesn't distinguish physical pain from emotional pain except over time. Physical pain, you slice your finger on a knife in the kitchen and it hurts like crazy instantly, but immediately the body begins fixing it. And so a minute later, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, usually within an hour, it's subsided greatly. Probably the next day, it's still tender, it's still sore. A week later, it's, if you break a leg or something, it might be 6 weeks, but the pain diminishes. Not a perfectly straight line graph, but pretty close. I mean, 2 months later, it's going to be done. That's not true with emotional pain. Emotional pain actually frequently, we don't say always, but frequently gets worse over time. And so if it's not processed, especially, and even if it is processed, it may come back up 10 years later and feel more intense than it did 10 years ago. And we still have to make safe space for that. And if we don't, we just reactivate. That's that whole 19 seconds things. If we don't make safe space for it, it's just going to reactivate and get worse and worse and worse. And that's the power of the ooh, I believe. Just if nothing else, the ooh buys you time just to be present with the other person and go, woo, wow, yeah, that's a lot. The ooh is not agreeing. The ooh is just being present with the other person and letting them know that you hear them.
Right. Yeah, I think about, you talking about the dam breaking, and you had first just said put a lid on it, and that oftentimes there are like small things that we're doing every day that may not make sense to our partner. Like one of the episodes we talked about, Wes was traveling a lot, and it was really difficult for me. And Glenn, you were like, well, I mean, you have experienced abandonment before. Like it makes sense of why. And I was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that this moment today is from my childhood. And so some things we just have to piece together. Yeah. And when we realize that, it's like a light bulb goes off of, I'm not broken. This makes so much sense of why I'm feeling this way. And then Wes and I can connect over it instead of it continuing to be a disconnect for us, because now we've traced it back to its origin of what's actually happening for me. And so I think that when you're in the dam breaking moment, have you reached a point, Phyllis, where you have been able to now trace it back to the origin, the specific origin of where you don't do anger?
Well, yeah. I mean, as I said a few minutes ago, I think that realizing that I never had a voice, and so I never questioned even like the decisions that were being made,
Right.
or I never had a voice to even say, this is really hard for me, which meant I didn't express anything that was happening with me. I remember one of the moves that we made, the schools were integrating at that time, and there was a lot of violence at the school because of that. And I felt fear every day going to school, but I didn't share that with anyone. And matter of fact, it was at my mom's passing, and she died at 90, that we were sitting around and we found a file that had letters that she had saved over her lifetime.
Right.
And one of the letters she wrote to my oldest sister, who has also passed away now, and she was telling her how my brother, that's just a year and a half older than I am, that he was experiencing a lot of fear at school because of all the violence. And both of us were reading this letter, and he looked at me and I looked at him, and he was like, "Oh wow, I had no idea that mom and dad knew how terrified I was to go to school."
Wow.
And then I said to him, I said, "I never said a word. I had no idea you felt that way, and I wasn't about to say it." So I was keeping it all to myself. And I feel a lot of sadness about that because, oh my word, if I had even confided in my brother,
Yeah.
he could have confided in me how terrified he was.
Right.
And we could have supported each other through every day going to school where, we thought we would be beat up or knifed or whatever. We would just be caught in the crossfire. And, we had no idea. And of course, he was shocked that my mom was aware, but never said anything to him, and said it in a letter to my older sister. And then, of course, no one ever asked me, "Are you getting bullied at school? Or, are you seeing fights?" Which that was, to me, what was terrifying. I never got hit at school, but I watched it, and I would be close by and I would feel like, oh my word, an angel must have just protected me because I was right there. Like, why didn't none of them hit me? And, that's pretty terrifying. And so just in answering your question, I think I'm now realizing that so many things happened in my life that I never said. I never told anyone. I never spoke up. Because I didn't have a voice.
I hear that. I get that completely. I relate to it in a lot of ways. You're talking about all these other emotions that you felt during that time, though. You're still not identifying the anger of it. And so the anger is what you're trying to burst right now and feel. And so I'm wondering was there someone else in your life that you saw that experience that was acted very angry and you're like, oh, I don't want to be like that. Or if there was a moment that you did let anger out and you got in trouble, if there was something, because you said you had sadness, you had fear, but there's still not an anger point that you are catching.
And I would suggest that, again, just living with this fascinating creature, I think not only did she not connect with anger, she wasn't allowed to connect with pre-anger or pre-anger. For example, one of her stories that she's probably shared before on the podcast is at one point her brothers, they were doing fireworks. Do you know how old you were?
No.
I mean, what would you guess? 5, 6, 7?
Yeah.
Pretty small. But they handed her a firecracker and said, "Here," and they lit it. And what they didn't tell her is to throw the thing.
Yeah.
And it blew up in her hand. And then they said, "Don't tell mom and dad." And obviously there's pain there. That's, a given, very clear. But that's an anger scenario. It's like, wait a minute, you jerks. You didn't tell me to throw the thing. Little Phyllis, am not a fireworks expert, and you should have cued me in on that matters. And now you're telling me don't have anger and don't tell anybody, don't say anything about it. And again, that's such an extreme scenario to have a firecracker blow up in your hand,
Right.
and you're not allowed to react. And I assume that you cried. I assume that you recognized and experienced the pain, but that there's, as far as I know, was no anger that was allowed in that situation.
Well, back to your question, Tira, specifically, that's interesting that you're saying that, because I had older brothers. I had the one that was only a year and a half, and we were two peas in a pod, and were quiet together, and shared a room and comforted each other often. But our older brothers were where I would see what I would label anger.
Yeah.
Screaming and yelling and fighting and hitting, and I mean, I have memories of that, but then I've heard stories, of they didn't hesitate, to grab a knife. They didn't hesitate to, throw a glass plate at the face of the other.
Yeah.
And so I think that was my definition of anger.
Yeah.
And no way did I want that in my life. That was terrifying to me. And no one ever spoke about it. Like, I don't remember ever anyone teaching me anything about emotions. And it was just, that was my demonstration. And then, it's like, so I mean, in answering your question, I didn't want that.
Right. Yeah.
And I didn't have any examples of a healthy show of anger, or I think anger was just always terrifying to me.
Right.
And it's probably still true to this day. Like, if I'm in a situation, we just were in New York City in December, and we did the subway train thing, subway everywhere we went. And every time we got on the subway, there was some kind of altercation between humans. And it's like, I just want to crawl in a hole when that happens. Like that, I don't get curious. I don't want to know what they're talking about. Like, to me, that is not acceptable behavior.
Right.
Like, and so I think that, I probably learned early on that I don't want that.
Yeah.
And so I will just go through life quiet, like, instead of having a voice. And it's interesting because I was talking to a couple of really good friends yesterday about all of this, and we had the core emotion wheel right there, and I said, this is the one. Anger, it's like I have such a hard time. I tend to go towards like whatever's happening, in the world today. Like, I have anger, about what's happening in Ukraine. Like, that's where I'll go. And she said, wow, that's really fascinating. Because so I left this part out. So one of the things that I've been also really dealing with in the last couple of weeks is the message that I was given very young is to be a good girl. And my being a good girl meant be quiet and obedient.
Right.
And so I've lived 60 years with that kind of as my operation, like operation.
Sure.
Yeah. My motto of you need to be a good girl,
Right.
which also goes into perfection for me. Like, you need to just be perfect, and then everyone will like you. And so then I'm realizing that has put a ton of pressure on the way I live every day.
Right.
And I don't know even really how to have fun. It's almost like I have to have a reason beyond just myself to have fun.
Yeah.
And so then my friend yesterday, she said, well, it sounds like anger connected to you having to be a good girl. And it was like the way she said it, it was like, oh my word, ding, 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 ding. I have a winner. Yes, that makes sense to me.
Right.
Like, oh, wow. okay, that is anger. But it's almost like I can barely touch it, almost like a hot stove. I can just barely touch it because it's like, whoa, that is, I would tend to say, yeah, I'm feeling sad about that versus I feel anger that is the message I am hearing day after day after day
Right.
in my psyche that I have to be perfect for the world to be okay. I have to be perfect.
And would it be fair to say that in your childhood, and again for a long time, not just when you were little bitty, you never saw a positive effect of anger? I think both sides of it. Number one, you saw the anger, whether it was with your brothers in schools, whatever, and you saw all these detrimental, harmful, damaging playouts of anger. And on the other side, and I would suggest as a connection coder, you did not see core level anger that drove people to accomplish good things, where positive strides were made, driven by anger, such as your mom speaking up to your dad just in general, but especially on behalf of you, to go, whoa, wait a minute. These are human beings involved here. These are not just chess pieces we're moving around. We have to tune in to them too. They exist as human beings. And so you never, we try not to say never, but you never saw that. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So anger for you is very clearly embedded in your hard drive that anger is just not a successful thing. The anger that I have seen is detrimental, and I've never seen anger be building and beneficial. So, and then you marry a guy who is a nonconformist, so now you have to balance out, and literally, I'd get thrown out of churches because I just didn't conform and didn't go with the party line. And so poor Phyllis is sitting here going, well, if I'm good enough, maybe the net result, Glenn is nonconformist to this degree. Well, I'll be conformist to balance it out, which of course didn't really work, but it's a neat idea. And so then you're just all the more, maybe even paralyzed to try to be the good girl that will balance out the Glenn bad side because I didn't conform.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah. Well, I told someone just yesterday that even the part of scripture where Jesus comes into the temple and overturns the tables.
Yeah.
And there's the word anger is used in that. And I have that doesn't work in my paradigm. That is not okay. You don't go in and turn over tables. That is, and I think just, just yesterday realizing I've never been comfortable with that story. I've never been comfortable with the way that plays out. And I think it fits my narrative, right?
Yeah.
Anger is not, it's not a good thing. And so it's kind of trapped up there in my brain. And
Yeah. Now, I'm glad that you shared that, because that's what I was wondering when asking that question, is that anger was presented to you as the reaction. You were seeing what looked like the reaction of anger, and you'll do everything you can to avoid that. And I think that is tricky for a lot of people, because oftentimes, even when we see what looks like anger, it's secondary anger. It's not even the real anger that's driving it. I think about talking about your school, going and they're integrating schools and people are getting fights. They look angry all the time. I would bet there's a lot of fear-based reaction there. There's a lot of shame-based reaction. I would imagine anger is not actually even the core level of what was happening for the majority of those students. But we see the anger reaction, and many of us will avoid. We go into fight, flight, or freeze. I think, is there one more? Did they add something else to that?
Who's they?
Like the people that made up the fight, flight, or freeze.
Now we kind of say fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. You just
okay, there we
cater
go.
to the
I knew
person.
there was another F in there.
I just didn't know who the they was.
Well, whoever made it up, they,
Well, that's
Who's
interesting
they?
that you're bringing up actually the fight or flight. And with my friends yesterday that were talking to me, one of them, she said, it's kind of like I with this whole anger thing, there's I don't know. I'm not going to do a good job describing it the way she did. She did such a beautiful job, but kind of like your body's response is to fight or flee. And she said, you were taught to do neither. You do not fight ever because you're a good girl.
Yeah.
And you also don't flee. You don't ever leave.
Which
and so,
keeps you in that
right.
detrimental scenario.
Like if a situation is really bad, you're a good girl, so you just stay. And I could relate to that so much.
Is that considered the fawn?
Or freeze. I mean,
Freeze.
certainly my history with Phyllis, so much freezing, but then the fawning, dealing with so many of my psychological disorder issues where she's just trying to keep things straight. This is a little thing, but we've evolved a lot over the years. And the other day, we both we have Yeti cups, and there's a logo on it. And I walked in the room, and, there's so many things that I'm discovering about Phyllis. I'm like, oh, well, dang, I didn't know. I just didn't notice. And Phyllis and I think she was refilling my cup. I don't remember.
No, it was mine.
Was it yours?
Yeah,
okay.
it was mine.
And then so she puts the lid on, and she lined the straw up with the logo. And I saw her, and I said, "What are you doing, young lady?" And it was very lighthearted initially. And she said, "Well, I'm," and she wasn't even sure. And she said, "Oh, well, I'm lining the straw." I'm like, "Absolutely not. You are not allowed to do that based on Glenn's experience, based on Glenn's emotion, based on Glenn's internals." And then to realize, oh, well, she's been doing that for years and years and years. She's been functioning based on what was happening with Glenn. The towels have to be folded a certain way and stacked a certain way because of what happens for Glenn. And again, I'm just discovering this more and more, but that's just not functional. That's not organic for her. And so now she's modulating all these behaviors based on my experience. And it was a connecting moment. And I was like, no, you function how you function. If you turn the light switch off the wrong way, quote unquote, the wrong way, fine. It doesn't matter. You don't have to do the things that matter to Glenn. And I have the right of request. I can ask her to, but she definitely has the right of refusal. But anyway, I just don't want her living every minute of every day thinking, okay, listen, Glenn would put the straw lined up with the what's it called? Logo. I want to say Yogo, because it's Yeti. But do we get a sponsorship spot there? Because I mentioned
we can
Yeti.
try.
I feel like we should.
Wow.
But just not even realizing for how many years, and again, we're talking many, 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 many thousands of times that you have done a behavior based on my experience, based on my emotion, not based on your own.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was interesting because, again, I mentioned it's been a tough couple of weeks. And part of it is it's so automatic for me. Like I know what is a pain point for him, like with light switches or doors or so many things.
I want to add here, if this is your first episode listening, Glenn experiences high levels of OCD. Is that the right way to say it?
Sure.
And you can go back to earlier episodes where Dr. Glenn and Phyllis talk about that. And there's even an episode, I didn't know he deals with OCD. Definitely go back and listen to that.
Yeah. And so, we've been married 40 years. So it's like I have an automatic way of functioning.
Right.
And probably more so in our actual home than like when we're on vacation and we're in a new place. Because then there's not a determination yet of all the systems or like how everything should be lined up or, all of that stuff. But we're home more than we're on the road. Yeah. And it's just an automatic. Like, even if it causes extra steps, I'll take all the extra steps to make sure all the light switches are in the correct position or whatever.
Have to put air quotes around correct.
Sure.
There is no correct.
But, as I'm untangling from all this, because a lot of it is pressure. Like, it's not, because it's not organic for me. It's just the pressure I've lived under to be perfect, to line things up perfectly, to, do it. And I think my body has gotten to a place where it's like tired. Like it's time to let go of all of that. And of course, it's interesting, like you mentioned abandonment, because there are things like I deal with fear of rejection. And I think in my mind, of course, if you knew our history, if we had a timeline here, it'd be almost shocking how many groups we've been thrown out of, churches we've been thrown out of, organizations we've been thrown out of, because Glenn will speak up. He's not one to just listen.
Right.
Like, it's not because Glenn was killing people.
Yeah.
So yes, you should be thrown out of a group if you're killing people. No, it was because he would speak up and he'd question the authority and he would go, okay, could you help me understand exactly why we're doing it this way? No, you do not question. You just do it. And Glenn is not one to just obey
Right.
when it makes no sense to him. He wants
Right.
someone to explain. So we've been in a lot of groups where they're like, we would just rather y'all leave. We're not going to answer your questions. We don't want to answer your questions. And you're not welcome here.
Yeah.
So that's kind of our story. And, Glenn has said it a minute ago, even just that I was part of the, I wasn't the one. I was the one doing all the right things, serving and volunteering and cooking. And so it was like, oh, but when he got thrown out, it was me and the kids too.
Yeah.
And so I think I have this trigger response, this trauma response of that, the fear of rejection. At this point, it's like, well, if I just am perfect, if I just remain that good girl, then everyone will love us and we won't get thrown out of groups. And so it's, it's not healthy. And the pressure is, it's like, oh, I can't live that way.
Yeah.
anymore.
And, just these last couple of weeks talking about this, I think it was more traumatic for you than it was for me, because when I would speak up and not conform like you're supposed to do, it was all organic for me. And so for me, this whatever church leadership, this group doesn't want me, well, then fine, I don't want them either. And it was just became this negative experience where I'm like, well, okay, we'll move. Well, simultaneously, you're having a wonderful experience and everybody likes you. And there were numerous groups that would want to get rid of me, but they wanted Phyllis to stay because she is so functional. She's so workable. Everybody likes her and she's incredibly productive. Everybody wanted her on their committee, their team, their ministry, whatever. And so I think she experienced more trauma from it than I did, because now she was always loyal to me, whether that was correct or not, I don't even know. But she was. And I think it was worse for her than for me, because it made sense to me. It's like, well, they don't like me. Well, I don't like them either. So fine, let's just leave. Whereas Phyllis is sitting over there going, wait, what? No, I'm doing everything well. I'm fitting in. I'm doing the work. I'm doing the good and right thing. And now I have to exit also. So it didn't even fit for her. Whereas for me, it fit. I was like, yeah, fine. They don't like me. I'm leaving. That I can live with that. And there was still pain in it for me, but I don't think it was nearly the trauma level. And I've just realized that, again, probably the last couple of weeks, and how intense that was for you.
Well, and circling all the way back to the question that started this whole episode, as far as, and you might be a good time to reiterate it, but it's realizing that, you need to process your childhood. You need to process whatever season in the past, because I'm realizing that, like, even with the fear of rejection, I didn't just make that one up. Like, it is from trauma after trauma of being thrown out of places that, yes, I had given my heart to, and these were my best friends, and this was our community. Wow. And then I was, that was it. And then it was another starting over, which was part of my childhood. It was a constant starting over because we moved so much. So I would make friends and then we'd move, and there was no discussion, no warning, no, hey, what does everyone think? Here's an opportunity. It was just like, whoo, we would all of a sudden be told we're moving.
Right.
And we would up and move. And so for me, it's just been this lifetime of that. And so at 60, I'm going, whew, this is really coming up, because I've created a lot of pressure for myself in that whole, I need to be a good girl / perfect human so that now people won't reject me.
Right.
I don't necessarily think of it as an us, but I mean, we
Right.
are an us. So, but it's still that, which goes back to you sharing about you were abandoned in your childhood. And so that comes out in your marriage with Wes when he travels a lot. And it's interesting because I thought about that. You were abandoned by your dad when he
Yeah.
died. You were abandoned by your mother when she had to go get several jobs to put food on the table.
Right.
And I know that the way it's played out in our marriage is that when I travel by myself, you are hit with a ton of loneliness and a ton of fear that I'm not going to come back. Well, that comes from
Yeah.
childhood abandonment.
Yeah, and to recognize that the psyche doesn't know the difference because, and literally right this minute, it occurs to me that so you go through your childhood, through your early years, and you're moving again, leaving everything you know, any positives that you've experienced, any connections, any relationships, not because you wanted to. It was complete. And again, I can just picture whatever an 8-year-old little Phyllis is just having fun. It's like, oh, this is cool. Oh, we're moving. And she just looks up like, wait, what? No, 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 no. This is good. Not that you had the voice to say that. And so then when our relationship develops and we end up getting moved on, moved out, whatever, it's the same. Your psyche doesn't know the difference. And so this is, but not because of Phyllis, and Phyllis is doing the thing. She's on the committee. She's, successful, connecting, all these positives. And then it's just kind of becomes clear, an announcement, whatever, that, oh, no. Glenn's out, therefore Phyllis is out, and you're just moving on. And the same with you, Tara, and I did want to mention that your brain, your psyche doesn't know the difference. So when Wes abandons you, of course, poor Wes is sitting over there going, wait, what? Abandoning you? I'm doing the thing.
Yeah.
I'm laying my life down
For
for
you.
our family, and you're mad at me? Well, that's because Tira's psyche is abandoned, and she doesn't know. And again, just the psyche, it's the same experience. It has nothing to do with intention. And we can argue that all day long. We can say, Tira, stop it. You stop feeling this pain. You stop experiencing loneliness. Stop experiencing abandonment because Wes is doing a good and right thing. That has nothing to do with it. Yes, he's doing a good and right thing, but you still experience the same thing. So I don't know. That just really hits me that's, what happened with you so many times.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Okay.
Mm.
Our time is where we would normally do the will right now.
Mhm.
I don't know if we should.
Yeah.
Is there anything else?
No,
in
I
your
think
heart?
this is a good time to do the wheel.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, then we're going to wrap up by doing our core emotion wheel, which this is our 4-minute tool that leads to connection. And there are rules to this wheel, and you will hear some of them as we go along. There's no defense. There's no arguing. One person's just sharing their experience in these emotions.
Yeah.
So,
So we don't have the wheel in front of us. We always have the wheel in front of us. But we've done it 19,000 times, so maybe we can remember it. So you want to do an issue specific, or what do you want to do?
Just go for it.
Okay. So for me, I feel so much sadness just, recognizing your traumatic experience over and over again. A lot of guilt in that. I mean, I was such I don't know what you'd call me, dynamic, crazy, maverick guy. And I'm just doing stuff. It never occurred to me that you were affected by that too. That those were big life things for you so much of the time. A bit of shame in that. It's like, I'm a smart guy. Dang it. I should have. We don't use the word should very often, but it's amazing that I just missed it so much. And of course, I was experiencing my own pain, experience with so many leaders and groups and whatever. And I just was oblivious. A lot of anger that, I think back to so many relationships, just thinking, what if they had just been kind? What if they had just been tender and gentle and patient, kind of like we teach in our faith-based groups, to actually do that instead of just being so immediately offended and getting rid of the pain source, which was me so much of the time. Of course, a lot of loneliness in that. To this day, on our church quest, just the struggle of finding a group where I or we, when we moved to Nashville, I vowed to you that I wouldn't get thrown out in the first year, and we lasted 8 years, so that was pretty impressive. Thank you very much. But a good bit of loneliness in that, or so many hurts, hurts for myself, hurts for you, hurts for the ways that I brought you pain. That again, whether I was aware of it or not, there was a lot of pain in it for you. A lot of joy that we're together. It's amazing. I just love our story with all of the crap in it. The fact that we've been able to dance and navigate and have a lot of fun together, and that you've been loyal to me, which I still am not sure that those were always the smartest choices, but you were, and I felt a lot of joy and identity that you have honored me in that. I think I'm close to 8. I lost track.
Okay. Wow. This is hard. I definitely feel anger that I've not had a voice, and that I've believed a lie that I had to be perfect to balance out your crazy.
Yeah.
I think I feel in the moment fear that I won't get through to the other side of all of this. Like, because, I'm 60, life's good, the sun is shining, like just, the whole, you're fine. So there's some fear that I won't see it all the way through. There's guilt and shame in it, because here we're teaching the thing, and then to realize, wow, I have not, in all the years that we've been doing the core emotion wheel, I've really not touched that anger region of my brain, like some guilt and shame, and that it's just finally coming out.
Yeah.
Like it's been kind of forced out, is what I would say at this point. Lonely, I do, even in just the last couple of weeks, I feel lonely. And I've told quite a few friends that I've seen lately. I think that a lot of my friends think we're too busy. And so they don't just reach out like friends do, like spontaneous, hey, what you doing? Let's go for a walk, or let's go grab a coffee. Like, and I've shared that with friends lately, and their responses have been really beautiful. I think hurt from just, I think with you, even in the last 2 weeks, I think, I would say you've not oohed me well on a few occasions. And I've really needed that. I've needed you just to make space for all this. Sad that, just sad that this is my story. Like, like, wow, that's really sad. And joy, definitely, I do feel joy that I didn't give up on you, and we didn't give up on each other, and joy that we have really a beautiful life. And, you often say to me that you would love for me to not live under this pressure. Like you would love for me to just enjoy my day and choose the things I'd love to do in my day. And so joy and just in what is to come and what we do, we are surrounded by beautiful things. Like it's as far as in the current moment of my life, I get to live a dream, but I'm blocking it from being that because of the this whole I need to be perfect and all of that. So
Wow.
that's it.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much for being vulnerable and sharing what's been happening for you. I know so many people relate. I totally hear the sadness in your story, and I feel like most people would relate to that. Whether it's the feeling of needing to be perfect or the feeling like they're the crazy one in the relationship. I'm the one that always causes the problem, or that I don't have a voice in my marriage or life, really. And then also the struggle of not being able to connect with certain emotions, because we've been seeing the reactions of them, and we don't want anything to do with that. We don't want to look like we're in our house alone all the time. So we're going to go put ourselves in the room where everybody is and just feel lonely there, And so we tend to go against certain emotions so hard, but it's actually to our detriment, over time, because our body still feels it. And it's so important. So that's why, Glenn, you say all the time that the earlier you begin this process, the easier it is. And it's hard. And I say the word easier, and that doesn't mean it's not difficult, to walk through, but it can get you to the other side faster without creating more and more damage in your relationship. And
Absolutely.
so thank you to all of our listeners for being here. If you have not left us a 5-star review yet, I would love if you would get on. I love reading our reviews, seeing who is listening, seeing what's connecting with them, whether it's on Spotify or on your Apple podcasting app. That's just such a gift to us. And if you're interested in more of what we teach and what we do, you can download our core emotion wheel. Go to connectioncodes.co/podcast. And that's where you can get our tools, our information, so you can begin your journey. And today's episode, you're like, I don't want to be on that journey. That sounds hard. And you're right, it is. But at the same time, there is so much connection that comes from it. We are able to dance with each other despite the traumas that are in our past, because we have the verbiage to communicate what's happening. And that is the key to changing everything.
Absolutely.
Everything. And so we know that you are here because...
Yeah. And we do encourage you to spread the connection codes. I needed this about 50 years ago. So share it with your friends, and you'll be able to say to them, you need this.
You deserve this.
So let's do this.
Let's do this.